The fog had not so much descended upon Flaxborough as quietly occupied it, like a courteous visitor refusing to leave. It thickened by the minute, swallowing the pale lamplight until only vague shapes floated in the grey. People, animals, perhaps memories. By 6 o'clock, those gathered for the lantern walk appeared as a procession of ghosts already, moving through the market square with dutiful cheer and mild irritation in equal measure. Mrs. Copley, the mayor, marched in front carrying a paper lantern of such municipal sturdiness that it could have illuminated a bunker. Behind her trailed a dozen children, chattering and clanking their tin holders, their parents close enough to remind them of manners, but far enough to deny responsibility for the noise. The vicar walked beside the police constable on duty, young Harby, whose reflective band was the only modern feature in sight. He appeared grateful for the conversation, though the vicar's comments largely concerned the inadequacy of the church's heating system. By the time the parade reached Black Hollow Lane, enthusiasm had dwindled to murmured complaints about mud and missed suppers. The Hollow, always a melancholy stretch even in daylight, was now little more than a gullet of mist. The hedges crouched close, dripping faintly, and the air had the smell of wet stone and buried leaves. A few children pressed closer to their parents. Someone began a hymn softly and badly. Then, near the bend where the lane dipped toward the stream, the hymn faltered. A woman at the back gasped, a sharp intake, theatrical yet sincere, and all eyes turned ahead. Through the milky veil of fog glimmered another light. It swayed gently, higher than the lanterns of the children, moving not toward, but across the path. A figure accompanied it, tall, slight, its outline uncertain. The procession stopped. The vicar raised his lamp, but its beam reached only a few yards before dissolving. "Who's there?" he called, in the voice of a man who both hopes and fears an answer. No reply came, only the faint rustle of fabric. The light turned slightly, catching for an instant what looked like the edge of a veil, or perhaps a curtain of hair, and then, as if the fog had swallowed breath and form alike, it vanished. For several moments no one moved. Then a child laughed nervously, which seemed to release the others from enchantment. Someone muttered about student pranks. Another insisted it was a reflection from the stream. Mrs. Copley declared, with mayoral firmness, that the incident should be ignored for the sake of civic dignity, and urged the parade onward. But gossip has better legs than dignity. By the time the crowd reached the market square, half of Flaxborough had heard that a ghostly woman had appeared among them, carrying an old-fashioned lantern and singing an unholy tune. The tale grew with each retelling. Later that evening, Constable Harby, dispatched to ensure all lanterns were extinguished in an orderly fashion, cycled back down the hollow. The fog still hung thick, a smothering curtain that swallowed sound. He dismounted where the apparition had been seen, his lamp beam jittering over the wet hedgerow. There was nothing, no footprints, no scraps of cloth, no sign of mischief. He almost turned back when something glinted in the ditch. He knelt, wiping away the wet leaves. A small brown wallet lay half-buried, its leather swollen from damp. Inside was an identification card, edges curled and ink faintly run. The name, when he held it near the lamp, made him pause. Constable Ernest Bligh. Harby frowned. Bligh had been dead 15 years, a story occasionally revived in the canteen whenever someone needed to fill a silence. An old case, nothing mysterious, merely a man who'd collapsed after chasing a stray dog through the allotments. Still, finding his card here, now, beside a phantom's path, felt uncomfortably like the sort of coincidence newspapers enjoyed. He brought the wallet to Sergeant Love, who inspected it with professional distaste. "Old rubbish," Love pronounced. "Blown here by wind, likely." Harby reminded him that there had been no wind. Love glared, then compromised with, "Well, blown here long ago." When Inspector Purbright arrived the next morning, the matter was placed on his desk with an apologetic note. Maybe nothing, sir, but odd. He examined the card as he might a mildly perplexing insect. The photograph, sepia and faintly mournful, showed Bligh in his prime, wearing the expression common to policemen of the era, wary optimism tempered by bureaucracy. Where was this found? Purbright asked, and Harby, summoned from his tea, explained. The inspector listened, nodded, and asked nothing further until the end. You're certain it was exactly there, not dropped from one of our own pockets earlier? No, sir, Harby said, flushing. I'd remember losing a wallet. Purbright smiled slightly. I should hope so. He turned the card over once more, then slipped it into a paper envelope. Well, perhaps Mr. Bligh's ghost came out to retrieve old property and mislaid it again. Love gave a cautious chuckle. You don't think there's anything in it, sir? Oh, there's something in everything, Purbright replied mildly, glancing toward the station window where fog pressed against the glass like frosted breath. The trick is discovering what and whether it matters. By afternoon, the Flaxborough Chronicle had its headline. The accompanying illustration, a rough sketch of a spectral woman with a halo of lamplight, bore little resemblance to anyone living or dead. Mrs. Gloss, who ran the florist, claimed she recognized the shape of the dress. The librarian insisted the humming resembled a hymn sung only at funerals. The butcher, for reasons no one queried, began closing an hour earlier, and as the town folded into evening, Inspector Purbright, reviewing the day's reports in his quiet office, paused once more over the envelope on his desk. He tapped it gently, then looked toward the window. Beyond the pane, the fog was thick again, moving in slow coils down toward Black Hollow Lane. He wondered, not with alarm, but with the calm curiosity of a man who preferred puzzles to peace. What might draw someone, living or otherwise, to walk that path with a lantern? By the following morning, the fog had lifted, leaving the streets washed and faintly gleaming, as if Flaxborough had been scrubbed clean of mystery overnight. But the air inside its shops and parlours told another story. Whatever the mist had hidden, the townspeople were determined to see, or at least to describe, in exhaustive detail. At Mrs. Gloss's florist shop, 3 customers lingered long after their purchases were wrapped, speaking in voices meant to sound confidential, but perfectly audible to anyone within 10 yards. Mrs. Gloss, whose talent for selective listening was unmatched, managed to agree with each in turn. Yes, she said, she too had heard it was a young woman in white. Yes, certainly. There was talk of it being a ghost, but didn't ghosts usually prefer churchyards? And no, she hadn't seen it herself, though she could easily imagine the poor soul drifting through the hollow. The customers left, convinced that Mrs. Gloss possessed a source of spiritual insight. Unknown to the rest of the town, at the post office, Mr. Hodges, who never read beyond the headlines, declared that the police had already identified the apparition as a deranged actress from Lincoln. He refused to name his source, but implied that his brother-in-law's cousin had once worked with the constabulary. Meanwhile, the vicar's wife confided to her bridge circle that the sighting was a warning. Not for us, of course, but perhaps for those who meddle with forces they don't understand. She left unspecific who those meddlers might be, which was considered tactful. By noon, the Flaxborough Chronicle's sketch of the so-called lantern girl had been reproduced in the baker's window, where it served to increase both gossip and bun sales. The general agreement, even among those who doubted the supernatural, was that something peculiar had happened, and that it would have been irresponsible of the police not to pursue it. Inspector Purbright, arriving at the station from a late breakfast, found Sergeant Love already besieged by civic curiosity. 2 letters lay on the desk, one requesting that the hollow be properly exorcised, the other offering a reward for authentic ghost photographs. Purbright read them both, placed them neatly aside and poured tea. Public interest seems lively. he observed. Love grunted. You'd think someone had been murdered. That, said Purbright, would certainly be simpler to explain. He sipped his tea, considering. Has anyone come forward claiming responsibility for the performance? Not so far. The lads asked at the theatre group. They say their costumes are all accounted for. Quite remarkable, the things that go missing only when we wish them not to. Purbright smiled faintly. Still, if the apparition's intention was to be noticed, she succeeded admirably. He spent the next hour reading the reports from the constables who had revisited the lane in daylight. Nothing unusual: trampled grass, a few lost candle holders, a discarded sweet wrapper. The wallet, damp and faintly mouldering, remained the only tangible relic. Purbright studied it again, as though the leather might eventually confess something. After lunch, he took a slow walk through the market square. The usual traders were there, their conversation flowing easily from cabbage prices to spectral phenomena. Mrs. Gloss waved from her stall, all brightness and innuendo. Terrible business, Inspector. Poor Mr. Bligh's name dragged up again, yet after all these years. Purbright paused. You knew him? Oh, everyone did, she said, lowering her voice. He was very fond of company, always stopped to chat, especially with the widows. Such a shame about his heart. She arranged a vase as if in tribute, then leaned forward. They say his niece used to visit. A pretty girl, a bit wild, not from around here. Perhaps she's come back. Perhaps, Purbright said, though his tone made the word sound more like a bookmark than a conclusion. He walked on, thinking of Bligh's quiet service record, his modest pension, his death neatly documented and unremarkable. The past in Flaxborough rarely stayed buried, but it seldom rose in such theatrical form. At the library, Miss Trower intercepted him with a nervous flutter of papers. Inspector, I thought it my duty to tell you I heard the song. The night of the walk. A few bars only, but unmistakable. A hymn, I'm sure of it. Do you recall which hymn? Something about light. Lead, kindly light, I think. He thanked her, making a note. As she bustled away, relieved of civic responsibility, Purbright lingered by the window. Beyond it, the town square glowed pale under the weak sun, its people moving about with the brisk purpose that follows a pleasant scandal. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was engaged in a telephone conversation of visible discomfort. He handed the receiver to Purbright with the air of a man passing a hot kettle. The mayor, sir. Wants reassurance. Mrs. Copley's voice emerged bright and official. Inspector, the council feels it's important the public see that the matter is in hand. We can't have people thinking there are unquiet spirits haunting public events. Perhaps a short statement? Purbright listened patiently, then replied, Certainly. Madam Mayor, I shall assure the Chronicle that the apparition poses no threat to public order, living or otherwise. Excellent, she said, missing the irony entirely. When the call ended, Purbright sat for a while, the telephone still in his hand. Outside, the late afternoon mist had begun to gather again at the edges of the town, a thin veil drifting in from the fields. The hollow would soon be swallowed once more. He thought of Mrs. Gloss's remark, of the niece no one could quite name, and of a hymn drifting through fog. He put down the receiver, rose, and reached for his coat. I think, he said quietly, more to himself than to Love, a little air from Black Hollow might do us some good. And as the gas lamps flickered to life along the emptying street, the inspector stepped out into the returning fog, his silhouette merging with the grey, as though following a lantern no one else could see. The air in Black Hollow carried that damp, metallic chill particular to autumn evenings when the daylight has retreated without resistance. Purbright's shoes made little sound on the narrow lane as he walked, his lamp's beam brushing over the hedgerows like a gentle, deliberate search. There was nothing remarkable to see, no prints, no fabric caught on thorns, no hint of the spectral presence that had so exercised Flaxborough's imagination. Yet Purbright's pace slowed now and then, as though he were listening not to the night itself, but to something the silence might eventually disclose. Halfway down the lane, he stopped where Constable Harby had found the wallet. The ditch, shallow and still wet from the fog, reflected the faint light of his torch. Purbright crouched, peering with mild curiosity. The ground was disturbed in a patch wider than a single footstep. He touched the soil with his gloved fingers. It was soft but compacted at the edges, not new, perhaps a day or two old. He straightened, letting the beams sweep upward. The hedgerow bowed over the lane, forming an archway that gave the place a tunnel's sense of secrecy. When he turned back toward town, the faint chime of a bicycle bell sounded from behind. Harby emerged from the gloom, apologetic and slightly out of breath. "Didn't mean to startle you, sir." "You didn't," said Purbright mildly, "though that's a rare compliment for a constable to give himself." Harby smiled uncertainly. "Thought you might want company." "Company," said Purbright, glancing again at the ditch, "is always useful when looking for things one doesn't yet know are missing." They walked together toward the square, the fog beginning to thicken once more around the lamps. After a while, Purbright said, "You knew Bligh, didn't you?" "Before my time." "Only just, sir. He retired when I joined. Liked his pipe, but a good man. Lived alone after his sister died. No mention of a niece." Harby hesitated. He used to talk about someone visiting. "A girl, yes, but we thought he was making her up. Said she'd come from Nottingham, worked in a shop there." "Never saw her ourselves," Purbright gave a small nod. "And when he died?" "Heart attack on patrol. They said he'd been chasing a stray dog." Harby paused, then added awkwardly, "I always wondered if it was worth the chase." "Few things are," Purbright murmured. They parted near the market, and the inspector continued alone through the dim streets. Flaxborough by night was not unfriendly, only reserved, its shop-fronts closed like lips keeping a confidence. A few windows glowed above the square, the tailor's wife reading by lamplight, the lodgers at the Blue Boar playing cards without much conversation. Purbright's gaze lingered on the newspaper office across the way, where the editor, Mr. Carter, could be seen hunched at his desk. No doubt he was preparing a second installment of the Lantern Girl story. The following morning brought neither rain nor clarity. The town's appetite for marvels, unchecked by facts, had grown overnight. The Chronicle's headline, "Constable's Ghost Returns to Haunt Lane," had sent coffee cups trembling in breakfast parlours. Sergeant Love, looking harassed, laid a copy on Purbright's desk. "If we don't find a culprit soon, sir, we'll have to start arresting journalists." Purbright read the article in silence. The reporter had somehow learned about the recovered wallet, but not the inspector's reluctance to comment. The piece implied a connection between the late Constable Bligh and unresolved matters of justice, which was nonsense, but effective nonsense. "Mr. Carter," Purbright said at last, "must have an excellent sense of narrative. Would you like me to have a word with him?" No, said Purbright. "One should never interrupt a man who's writing fiction. It might drive him to reality." He folded the paper neatly and looked through the morning's post. One envelope bore no return address, the handwriting small and precise. Inside was a brief note. "If you wish to know why the girl carries a lantern, ask at the waterworks, but not during the day." There was no signature. Love watched as Purbright reread it twice, expression unchanged. "Crank letter?" "Possibly," Purbright said, slipping it back into the envelope. "Though our cranks here tend to prefer committees." He spent the afternoon reviewing old personnel files. Bligh's record was exemplary, his retirement modest. No mention of family beyond the sister. The niece remained a rumour. Yet, among the papers was a letter of commendation from the borough engineer, the head of the very waterworks mentioned in the note. Purbright read it slowly, tapping the desk with one finger. At dusk he walked again toward the hollow. The lamps burned faint and low, the air damp and faintly metallic. He followed the path past the stream until he could see, in the distance, the outline of the old pumping station, a squat brick building half swallowed by ivy. Its windows were dark, save for one, high and narrow, through which a small, steady light glimmered. Not bright enough for electric, not flickering like a torch. It was the steady glow of a flame enclosed in glass. Purbright stood very still, his breath fogging the chill air. For a long moment nothing moved. Then, slowly, the light dimmed, as though someone within had turned the wick down to nothing. He waited another minute, then turned back toward town. There would be time enough for questions in the morning. Tonight, he preferred to let the fog speak first. The following morning brought with it the kind of brittle sunlight that made every roof tile glint and every unwashed window confess its neglect. Inspector Purbright, arriving at the station with his usual unhurried gait, found Sergeant Love gazing at the telephone as though it had just offered him moral advice. "She's on again, sir," Love said. "Mrs. Endicott claims she's seen the Lantern Girl twice before this week, and both times someone in her street fell ill." Purbright set down his hat. "2 in a week? Flaxborough's mortality may yet make the national news." "She insists it's a warning," Love said, lowering his voice as if gossip might be contagious. "And that the ghost is connected to Constable Bligh's death." Purbright regarded him with mild amusement. "A spectral whistleblower, then? Very civic-minded. Did she say when she might be free to share her revelations?" "She said she's free now, sir. Or rather, she's already here." Mrs. Endicott was waiting in the corridor, her frame thin but upright, her hat decorated with artificial violets that trembled when she moved. Her expression was one of solemn self-importance, as though she had come not to report, but to confirm something the police had shamefully overlooked. Purbright ushered her into his office, offering a chair and tea, both of which she accepted as if they were her due. "I saw her." "Inspector," she began without preamble, the same figure as before. "Once by the hollow, once near the bridge. Both times that same light, soft, like oil lamps used to be. And both times, within a day or two, someone was taken ill. Mr. Fletcher with his heart, and then Miss Lamb with her nerves." Purbright nodded, his face attentive, but unreadable. "And how long ago was the first of these occasions?" 10 days, near enough. Just before the fogs began. He let the silence stretch until she added, rather more cautiously, "You don't think it's coincidence, do you?" "Coincidence," Purbright said gently, "is an excellent suspect, Mrs. Endicott. It's guilty of most things we don't understand." Her lips pursed, uncertain whether that was sympathy or mockery. "I'm not one for nonsense, Inspector. My husband, God rest him, was on the council for 20 years. I know how people laugh at talk of spirits. But I saw what I saw." "Of course," said Purbright. "Tell me, when you saw her, did she notice you?" Mrs. Endicott hesitated. "The second time, perhaps?" The lantern swung toward me as if she'd turned her head. "I felt it, like being looked through." "Through, not at?" She shivered faintly. "Yes." Purbright wrote something on his pad that might have been a note or a doodle. "And you've lived here long?" "All my life. Then you'll know the late Constable Bligh." Her eyes brightened. "Ernie Bligh! Oh, I knew him well." Always polite, never pushy. Used to stop by after rounds for a cup of tea. Purely friendly, you understand. My husband liked him too, though he thought Ernie was soft-hearted for a policeman. Did he ever mention family? She paused, remembering. "Only once. Said his niece had been through some trouble. He wouldn't say what, but he asked if I might know of a room to let. She never came, though." "Not that I heard. Did you happen to know where she lived?" "He said Grantham or thereabouts." Purbright thanked her, then asked if she could recall anything unusual near the hollow lately. Strangers, vehicles, noises. She pursed her lips in thought. "There was a car 2 nights ago. Black, parked near the turning. No lights. I thought it odd, but you see such things now. Young couples, I suppose." "Indeed," said Purbright. "And you've seen no lanterns since?" "No, Inspector. But I keep my curtains drawn after dusk." He escorted her out with his usual civility, watching her hat bob down the corridor like a cautious violet on a breeze. When she was gone, he stood by the window for a moment, the morning sunlight flattening across the papers on his desk. Love entered, expectant.
"Anything useful?" "Nothing conclusive," said Purbright.
Though Mrs. Endicott's observations are at least consistent. With the ghost, with human behaviour, Purbright said. "It's remarkable how clearly people see when fog prevents it." He returned to his notes. Bligh's niece again.
"A car in the lane."
A flame visible at the pumping station. The strands began to weave, thin but persistent. That afternoon, Purbright walked to the hollow once more, this time along the footpath that ran parallel to the stream. A solitary figure waited ahead, a man in a fisherman's cap, leaning on the rail by the waterworks gate. He nodded as Purbright approached. "Afternoon, Inspector. You'll be after the ghost, I reckon." "Only if she promises not to run," said Purbright.
"And you are Baldry?"
"Night watchman here. Been on duty when she's about, they say. Have you seen her yourself?" "Can't say I have. Heard a step or two once, though."
"Like, careful. Not ghostly. More like someone who doesn't want to be heard." "Someone?"
Baldry shrugged. "Could be anyone. Fog makes fools of ears. Still," he hesitated, "there's been a light now and then in the old inspection shed."
"Thought it was kids."
"Maybe not." Purbright looked toward the squat outline of the shed. The door hung crookedly, padlock rusted, but the ground before it bore faint, fresh prints. He turned back to the watchman. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Baldry. If the lady with the lantern should visit again, do be kind enough to note whether she knocks." That evening, as Purbright made his way back to town, the sky bruised itself into twilight. Behind him, the first coils of mist crept once more along the hollow, and a single, faint light flickered briefly near the shed, steady, deliberate, as though marking its own return. By the next morning, Flaxborough's appetite for explanation had reached the point where people were willing to accept almost any story so long as it did not leave the matter unsolved. The prevailing favourite, encouraged by a brief and regrettably vague statement from the mayor's office, was that the lantern girl had been part of an unauthorised dramatic display. This, in turn, had led to the natural question of who in town might be inclined toward theatrics. The answer, inevitably, was Arthur Brim. Brim was the borough clerk's assistant, a conscientious young man with thinning hair, an overdeveloped sense of punctuality, and a hobby of writing earnest historical pageants for the local drama society. His most recent production, The Siege of Flaxborough, had featured both a smoke machine and a near-fatal accident with a papier-mâché cannon. The police had been obliged to attend, which perhaps explained why his name came readily to everyone's lips now. Purbright heard it first from Mrs. Gloss, who appeared at the station bearing chrysanthemums and confidential urgency. "I don't like to cast aspersions, Inspector, but if anyone were to appear in a white gown with a lantern, purely for the sake of atmosphere, it would be Mr. Brim. You know how these artistic types are." "Indeed," said Purbright, eyeing the flowers with suspicion. "And does Mr. Brim often rehearse his art in ditches?" Mrs. Gloss gave him a reproachful look, the sort reserved for those who take gossip too literally. "I'm only saying it wouldn't surprise me." That same afternoon, Purbright walked to the town offices. He found Brim alone in the records room, carefully aligning folders with the precision of a man determined to impose order on the universe. The young clerk started when Purbright spoke his name, knocking a stack of papers askew. "Inspector!"
"I wasn't expecting, well, is something wrong?"
"Not at all," said Purbright pleasantly, "though I thought you might clear up a small curiosity. You're involved in the drama society, I believe?" Brim nodded, eager to be agreeable.
"I am, sir."
"Treasurer and sometime playwright. We're preparing a Christmas piece, though it's early days. Any use of lanterns or costumes in rehearsal lately?" Brim blinked, colour rising. "Lanterns? Good heavens, no. Health and safety would never permit it indoors."
"Why do you ask?"
"Oh, only because the town seems persuaded that a ghostly figure in the hollow was one of your inventions. I thought it fair to let you deny it before they elect you producer of the supernatural." Brim laughed uneasily. I suppose that's flattering in a way, but I had nothing to do with it. I was at the Blue Boar that evening helping with the raffle. Purbright's gaze drifted toward the neat pile of ledgers on the desk. And after the raffle?
At home, sir, alone, of course. Purbright smiled faintly.
A dangerous alibi, utterly respectable and impossible to prove, Brim swallowed. You don't think I had anything to do with it? I think, said Purbright, that Flaxborough requires periodic excitement, and you, Mr. Brim, are the most conveniently visible spark available. But don't let that trouble you. Being suspected of harmless eccentricity is practically a civic honour. Brim attempted a nervous chuckle, which failed to convince even himself. As Purbright turned to leave, he added hastily, If it helps, I do have an old lantern at home, from the last play.
I could bring it in. That would be most obliging, Purbright said, with the air of a man humbly accepting an unnecessary favour. Outside, the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp paper.
The inspector walked to the end of the street, pausing where the square opened into the market. Across the way, he saw Brim hurrying out of the office, looking over his shoulder like a man anxious to be seen not hurrying at all. That evening, Purbright found himself again at the station, reading through reports of Bligh's old cases. They were mostly trivial, petty thefts, quarrels, the occasional lost bicycle. Yet one note caught his attention, a reprimand for mishandling evidence during a waterworks dispute some 20 years earlier. The case had involved mislaid accounts, an accusation of missing funds, and a quiet resolution that satisfied no one but avoided embarrassment. The borough clerk at the time had been Brim's uncle. Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers.
A ghost, a dead constable, a young man anxious to appear honest.
The threads were not yet connected, but they seemed to recognize one another. When Sergeant Love entered, carrying the Evening Post, Purbright nodded toward the window. Keep an eye on Mr. Brim tonight, discreetly. If he goes walking, I'd be interested to know where. Think he's our ghost, sir?
I think, Purbright said, folding the report,
that he's respectable enough to be dangerous. As night fell, Love's constable reported back Brim had indeed gone walking down toward the hollow, a lantern in his hand. Yet when they followed, the lane was empty, and the light had vanished into the fog as neatly as before. The hollow lay quiet that night, blanketed by a fog so thick it seemed to swallow the lamps one by one. From a distance, the air shimmered faintly with moisture.
Up close it clung to the skin like breath.
Inspector Purbright stood at the edge of the lane, listening. Not for voices, he had learned that ghosts,
real or fabricated, preferred silence, but for the small.
Human sounds that accompany deceit, a shift of weight, a misplaced footstep, the faint click of something handled too carefully. He heard nothing at first beyond the dull, slow rhythm of water trickling into the ditch. Somewhere farther along a dog barked once and was immediately scolded into quiet. Purbright's eyes followed the faint strip of mud where cartwheels had once bitten deep, now glossy under the mist. He waited. Then faintly there came a sound, not loud but distinct, a scrape followed by a hollow knock as if wood had met stone. It came again, rhythmic, measured.
A man mending something or prying.
The sound carried oddly through the fog, its direction uncertain. Purbright stepped forward, the lantern in his hand, turned low. When the mist shifted, he saw what might have been a flicker of light near the waterworks gate. It pulsed once, disappeared, and then, several seconds later, reappeared farther to the right, too slow for a swinging lamp, too deliberate for coincidence. He moved closer, his shoes whispering on the damp road. The light vanished. A moment later came another sound, softer this time, the faint creak of a door closing. Purbright reached the gate and found it unlocked, the padlock dangling open as though recently handled. He lifted it, examining the clean scratch on the shank. Someone had forced it, but without haste or noise. He pushed the gate inward, its hinges groaning. Inside, the outline of the old inspection shed loomed dark against the grey air. He approached quietly, stopping short of the doorway. From within came the faint rustle of paper and the soft clink of metal on glass. The inspector's expression did not change, but his posture grew stiller, more deliberate. A shadow moved past the crack of the door. Then a voice, low muttering, words indistinct except for one that seemed to echo oddly. Bly. Purbright stepped back into the fog, letting his own lamp fade.
After a few moments, the noises stopped.
The door creaked again, and the shadow emerged, carrying a small lantern that burned with steady yellow light. The figure turned away, following the path toward the lane. As it passed, within several yards of him, Purbright saw a shape of medium height, wrapped in a long coat, face half hidden by a scarf. Not brim too broad in the shoulder. Not Mrs. Endicott either. The gait was brisk but cautious, the sort of walk that tries to look casual while listening backward. Purbright followed at a distance. The figure turned onto the main road, then toward the railway bridge. There, it paused briefly, as if uncertain which way to go. In that pause came another sound, the whistle of an approaching train, faint and far but growing. The stranger stiffened, then began walking quickly in the opposite direction. The lantern shuttered at once. The fog swallowed them both. The following morning, Purbright was already at his desk when Sergeant Love entered, eyes bleary. "Kept watch on Brim's house, sir. He never left." "I rather suspected he wouldn't," said Purbright. "Then who was it down there?" "Someone who knows their way through fog," Purbright replied, "and someone who doesn't wish to be recognized doing it." He set down his teacup. "Have we heard from the waterworks office?" Love nodded. "The manager says nothing's missing. Just an old storeroom they don't use." He seemed puzzled why we asked. "Did you mention the padlock?" "I did." "He said there's no reason anyone should have had a key." Purbright opened his notebook, flipping to a page marked with a single word. Bly. Beneath it, he wrote, "Access, concealment, retrieval." Then after a pause, "Money?" Later that day, Mrs. Gloss arrived again, brimming with indignation.
"Have you heard, Inspector? They say the ghost spoke last night."
Mr. Phipps heard it plain as anything, calling out a name. "I trust Mr. Phipps knows his own," Purbright said mildly. "He says it was Bly or Blah, something like that. Don't you think that's significant?" "Possibly," said Purbright, and for once he was not entirely joking. That evening, as the lamps came on, he walked once more to the hollow. The fog was lighter now, but the air carried a stillness that seemed to wait. Near the gate, the padlock hung open again. He examined it closely. The scratch marks were fresh. Inside, the shed was empty, but the floor was damp in an odd pattern, as though a small crate had recently been moved. Near the wall, a faint indentation in the dust revealed a circle the size of a coin, something metallic, pressed hard, then lifted away. He knelt, tracing it with one gloved finger. Nearby lay a short length of string, frayed at one end and faintly smelling of paraffin. He pocketed it and straightened, listening again. There it was, the same faint rhythm as before, a scrape, then a hollow knock. Only now he realized it wasn't coming from the shed at all. It was echoing faintly through the ground beneath him. He stepped outside, following the sound toward the edge of the hollow, where the old culvert met the stream. The water glinted faintly under the lantern light. He leaned closer, listening again. The sound stopped. For several long moments there was only the trickle of the current. Then, somewhere far below, a faint, final clink, metal striking metal, and silence. Purbright looked up at the mist curling along the hedgerows and smiled very slightly, the expression of a man who had just heard the wrong note in an otherwise perfect tune. Inspector Purbright had long believed that few places yielded more information than a respectable parlour and a pot of tea. Mrs. Gloss's establishment, with its lace curtains and faint scent of carnations and gossip, provided both in generous measure. She had invited him just for a chat.
"Inspector, nothing official, you understand." And he accepted.
With the mild smile of a man who knew that the most revealing conversations often began with precisely that assurance. The florist's sitting room was a study in floral determination. Wallpaper, cushions, and even the teapot bore petals of some persuasion. Mrs. Gloss herself, immaculate in a mauve cardigan, poured with the self-conscious grace of someone certain that tea poured for a policeman should sound moral. "I do hope you take sugar, Inspector," she said, "because otherwise it feels like I've misjudged your character." Purbright accepted one lump, which seemed to satisfy her. "A curious week we've had, Mrs. Gloss," he began. "Oh, indeed," she said eagerly. "A haunted lane, a missing niece, and that dreadful business at the waterworks."
One can hardly sell lilies without someone asking if they're for the ghost. Business must be flourishing. Only in chrysanthemums, she said darkly.
"There's a morbid turn to people's taste when fogs linger." She leaned forward.
You found something, haven't you?
"I can tell by your manner. A woman knows when a man's pretending not to be interested." "Then you must find Flaxborough exhausting," said Purbright. She laughed, too loudly. "You always were a tease, Inspector. But I'll tell you something, just between us.
I think this lantern girl nonsense isn't nonsense at all."
Oh, not supernatural," she added quickly, "but deliberate. Someone wants to frighten people off the hollow at night. That's a precise theory. Do you have a precise reason?" She hesitated, eyes darting toward the window, though the lace revealed only the respectable street beyond. "Let's just say people talk when they shouldn't, especially when they owe money." Purbright stirred his tea slowly.
"Ah, and to whom is this debt owed?"
"Well," she said, lowering her voice, "there's been whispering about the town treasurer, Mr. Larkins. Nothing provable, of course. But he's been seen taking supper with that young clerk, Arthur Brim, and not in the sort of establishments where supper costs a shilling. There's talk of a missing account book."
"I dare say the hollow is a fine place to hide things one wishes unbalanced." "Mr. Larkins is a man of spotless arithmetic," Purbright said mildly. "Spotless arithmetic," Mrs. Gloss agreed.
"But muddy shoes."
"I saw them myself on Monday morning."
"And the hollow was the only place muddy enough to provide them." He nodded, appearing to absorb the information without judgment. "You've been very helpful, Mrs. Gloss. You have, if I may say, an admirable grasp of civic detail." "It's a civic duty to take notice, Inspector. I always say small towns rely on people who pay attention to other people's business."
"Otherwise, how would anything be kept respectable?"
Purbright rose, setting down his cup. "Indeed, though sometimes, I suspect, respectability requires a touch more imagination than honesty." When he reached the door, she stopped him with a sudden, almost shy question. "Do you believe in ghosts, Inspector?" He considered this as he adjusted his hat. "I believe," he said, "that most ghosts are people who can't bear to be forgotten, and a few who can't afford to be remembered." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment. "That's very clever," she said, though not quite warmly. As he stepped out into the afternoon light, the town seemed to hum with the quiet energy of speculation. The Chronicle's latest edition had a fresh headline, "Police Pursue Leads in Lantern Girl Case," and a sketch of Purbright himself looking more heroic than accurate. Children ran in the square pretending to chase ghosts, while adults nodded knowingly as though in possession of secret truths. At the station, Sergeant Love looked up from a stack of paperwork. "You've been visiting the lady florist, sir. I could smell the carnations halfway down the corridor." "Remarkable nose, Love," Purbright said. "She has quite the gift for arrangement of flowers and facts." "Anything useful among the petals?" "Possibly," Purbright replied, producing the small string he had found at the waterworks.
"Tell me, could this have tied up a ledger or parcel?" Love examined it. "Could have. Stout enough."
"Bit of oil on it, though." "Paraffin," Purbright corrected gently. "Our ghost's perfume of choice." He placed the string in an envelope. "Mrs. Gloss believes someone's been moving things through the hollow. Objects, not spirits." She mentioned Brim and the treasurer. "They dine together, it seems," Love frowned.
"Brim again. I can't see him frightening widows for the sake of bookkeeping." "Nor can I," said Purbright.
"But I can see him obeying someone who might be." That evening, the inspector returned briefly to the hollow. The mist was thin now, only a pale film drifting above the ditch. He paused by the gate, watching the last of the sunlight fade behind the hedges. Somewhere far down the lane, a door slammed softly. Then came the echo of wheels on gravel, slow, cautious, as though a cart or barrow were being moved under cover of twilight. Purbright smiled faintly. Tea, he reflected, had never failed him yet. He turned back toward town where the lights were beginning to bloom like small, civilized lanterns in the dusk. By dawn the following morning, a new murmur had already taken hold of Flaxborough, one less speculative, more fearful. It came first from the church verger, a man not given to exaggeration. At 5:30, while opening the church for early prayers, he had seen a light hanging among the graves. It wasn't electric, he insisted, nor any reflection from the road lamps. It was a lantern, the same pale yellow glow described by every witness of the first haunting, swaying from the yew tree nearest the north wall. By breakfast, the news had spread faster than the fog. Parishioners stopped one another in the street, demanding to know if the vicar would conduct an exorcism. Mrs. Copley, the mayor, called the police station before 8, declaring that something must be done if only for morale. Purbright, who had arrived a few minutes earlier, listened to her polite panic with his usual courtesy, promised to take all appropriate steps, and hung up before she could specify what those might be. "Another lantern," Love reported, looking weary. "They've taken it down now, but half the town saw it. The vicar's wife fainted." "Convenient," Purbright murmured, reading through the note on his desk. "She'll have something to recover from at least." Love gave a short laugh. "Do you think it's the same person?" "Whoever was in the hollow." "I think," Purbright said, standing, "that whoever hung the lantern wanted to move the story somewhere new. Perhaps they grew tired of the scenery." The churchyard was still damp when he arrived, the air carrying the mingled scent of wet grass and candle wax. The verger, Mr. Hobday, waited near the tree, his expression caught somewhere between pride and alarm. "I didn't touch it till your men came, Inspector. Thought best to leave evidence as was." "Very proper," Purbright said, examining the branch. A piece of frayed twine dangled where the lantern had been tied. The bark beneath showed a faint scorch mark, as though the flame had burned too close. He looked down at the soft ground beneath, mud, streaked with 2 sets of footprints, one broad, the other lighter and smaller. "Plenty of comings and goings here?" he asked. "Only me and the vicar mostly. Though last night, well, I heard something about 10 o'clock.
A cough, maybe?
Thought it was the wind in the gate." "The wind rarely smokes," Purbright said quietly, stooping to pick up a crushed cigarette butt near the hedge. "Our ghost seems to enjoy the occasional nicotine indulgence." He turned the butt between his fingers, noting the faint imprint of lipstick on the paper. "A lady's brand," he murmured. Later, back at the station, Purbright placed the evidence on his blotter beside the envelope containing the string from the waterworks. 2 small objects, neither important in isolation, but both bound by the same faint smell of paraffin. Love hovered by the door. "The Chronicle's asking for a statement against her. They say the town's demanding answers." "I've noticed the town demands answers most fervently when it least likes the questions," said Purbright. "Tell them we are pursuing several promising avenues. That should keep them occupied with speculation." That afternoon, he made a discreet call on Mr. Larkins, the borough treasurer. The man's office was neat to the point of obsession, the air heavy with the sweetish scent of pipe smoke. Larkins greeted him with forced cheerfulness.
"Inspector."
"To what do I owe the pleasure? Not another ghost, I hope?" "Only the lingering kind," Purbright replied. "I was wondering if you could assist me with a small matter concerning your assistant clerk, Mr. Brim." Larkins's fingers twitched.
"Arthur? Yes, of course."
"Diligent boy, if a little excitable."
"Has he done something foolish?"
"Not at all. I simply wish to confirm whether any council documents have gone missing recently. Ledgers, correspondence, financial summaries. Good heavens, no, said Larkins too quickly. We keep everything under lock and key. Purbright's gaze drifted to the keyring lying on the desk. Of course, you must be quite fond of those locks.
I hear they make a man feel secure. Larkins smiled, though his lips barely moved.
You police have your mysteries. We have ours, budgets and deficits. Much the same thing, really. Except ours, Mr. Larkins, Purbright said, slipping his notebook back into his coat, have a tendency to reappear. He left before Larkins could frame a reply. Outside, the sky had grown dull and heavy, and the faintest wisp of mist was creeping once more toward the town from the fields. He paused on the pavement, looking up at the church spire. The bell tolled the half-hour, a clear, precise sound. But underneath it, barely audible, came another noise, drifting faintly from the direction of the hollow, the steady creak of a wheel turning, slow and deliberate, like a barrow pushed across gravel. Purbright followed the sound until it vanished into the fog near the stream. There, faintly visible through the grey, something glimmered. Another lantern, low to the ground this time, moving steadily toward the ditch before dipping out of sight. When he reached the spot moments later, there was nothing left but the damp air and a faint trace of paraffin on the wind. He stood for a while, watching the fog close over the lane, and thought, not of ghosts or stolen ledgers, but of the wrong sounds that came from underground places. Wheels where there should be none, voices that did not echo properly. When he returned to the station, Love looked up from the evening paper. "Another light?"
"Yes," said Purbright.
"And this one, I think, was meant to be seen." He placed the cigarette butt beside the string, aligning them neatly like clues in an equation. "Tomorrow," he added, "we'll see what happens when a ghost begins to feel watched. Flaxborough, after a week of nightly fog and daytime conjecture, had developed the air of a place waiting for an announcement. Shopkeepers spoke in lowered tones as though the ghost itself might overhear, and every flicker of light in a window drew attention from those who pretended not to look. Inspector Purbright moved through the town with his usual calm, listening to the half-truths that swirled around him like the mist, until he found the one small piece that sounded too deliberate to be invented. It came, inevitably, from Mrs. Gloss. "Mr. Larkins has been behaving very oddly," she confided that morning, when she intercepted him outside the post office. "Ordering extra ledgers, staying late at the office, and sending poor Arthur Brim scurrying about like a hunted rabbit."
"I dare say it's guilt, Inspector."
"You know how guilt makes a man industrious." Purbright thanked her, as courteously as one thanks a weather report, and walked on toward the council offices. Inside he found Brim at his desk, surrounded by neat stacks of documents, and looking as though sleep had become a negotiable luxury. "Morning, Mr. Brim," Purbright said pleasantly. "I've come to ask a favour. I'd like you to bring a particular ledger to the police station this evening, the waterworks accounts for the year before last. If that's not too inconvenient." Brim blinked, clearly startled. "This evening, sir?"
"At the station?"
"Yes, around 7.
"It's only a formality, but you might find it interesting." Brim hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Of course, Inspector."
"I'll fetch it after work." When he had gone, Purbright climbed the stairs to Larkins's office. The treasurer was at his desk, a ledger open before him, though the ink on his pen had dried. He looked up, attempting a smile that faltered halfway. "I won't take much of your time, Mr. Larkins," Purbright said. "I only wish to thank you for your cooperation."
"It's been most illuminating." Larkins inclined his head, unsure whether it was gratitude or warning he was receiving.
"Always happy to assist the authorities, Inspector." "I imagine so," Purbright said, "particularly when illumination is at stake." That evening the fog returned, denser than ever, blurring the lamps until the whole town seemed to float in dim suspension. Inside the police station the lamps burned bright and steady. Sergeant Love waited by the door, his notebook ready. On Purbright's desk lay two objects, the frayed string and the lipstick-stained cigarette butt. At precisely 7, Arthur Brim arrived, clutching a brown ledger. He looked pale but composed. "Here it is, sir."
I had to ask Mr. Larkins for the key to the archive cupboard. Did you indeed?
Purbright's voice was mild.
And how did he respond?
"Said I was to be careful with it." He seemed
Nervous, Purbright gestured to a chair.
"Sit down, Mr. Brim. Tell me, have you any notion why someone would use an old inspection shed and a lantern to transport something through the hollow?" Brim's brow furrowed.
Transport, sir? No, well, unless it was to avoid being seen.
"An admirable deduction," said Purbright. "Avoiding being seen is, after all, the cornerstone of both crime and accountancy." Before Brim could frame a reply, the outer door opened. Larkins stepped in, damp from the fog, his expression hovering between irritation and alarm.
Inspector, I hear you've been asking for me.
"I thought it best to clear up any misunderstanding." "How thoughtful," Purbright said. "Do come in. Mr. Brim has brought one of your ledgers." Larkins's eyes flicked toward the book in Brim's hands. "Entirely routine," he said quickly. "Nothing of interest there?" "Indeed." Purbright's tone was courteous, but his gaze steady. "Then perhaps you'll explain why its lock was found forced last night, and why lantern light was seen near the waterworks where the council's old pay chest was buried for safekeeping during the war." Larkins stiffened. "Nonsense. That chest was emptied years ago." "Not entirely," said Purbright. "Constable Bligh, I suspect, found that out shortly before his death. A man of scruples, he may have intended to report the discrepancy. It seems someone else decided to resolve the matter more quietly." Brim turned pale. "Sir," Purbright raised a hand. "Mr. Brim, you need not alarm yourself. I believe your role has been chiefly that of reluctant accomplice." Larkins's voice hardened. "You have no proof of any such thing." "No." Purbright lifted the string and the cigarette butt. "Both recovered from your lanterns, Mr. Larkins. One binds your ledgers, the other carries your secretary's brand of lipstick. You see, guilt is as distinctive as handwriting." For a moment silence filled the room, heavy and precise. Then Larkins gave a small, strangled laugh. "You can't prove what was taken. It was council money, unclaimed funds." "Taken years ago," Purbright said, "and hidden under Bligh's watch. When he died, you waited, until now, to retrieve what remained. The ghost story was convenient cover. But unfortunately for you, ghosts don't smoke cigarettes." Larkins's shoulders sagged. He looked toward Brim, who sat rigid with horror. "You fool," he whispered. "You should have burned the lantern." "I think," said Purbright gently, "the time for burning things has passed." Love stepped forward, and Larkins made no resistance. As he was led away, Brim buried his face in his hands.
"I didn't know what he was doing, sir. He said it was only old papers, nothing criminal." "I dare say he meant it to be both," Purbright said softly. "Old papers often are." When the door closed, the inspector poured himself a cup
of lukewarm tea, gazing through the misted window toward the faint outline of the church spire. "You see, love," he said, "sometimes the best traps require no bait at all, just the promise of being listened to." The following morning dawned colourless and subdued, as though the town itself were reluctant to recall the previous night. The fog had lifted, leaving Flaxborough uncomfortably visible, its neat facades and tidy pavements betraying no trace of the drama that had quietly unfolded behind them. The Chronicle's presses had not yet turned. Rumour, for once, lagged behind reality. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, the faint smell of paraffin lingering like a ghost that refused to leave entirely. Larkins had spent the night in the cells, his protestations ebbing into silence some time after 2. Brim, released with a caution and a cup of tea, had been sent home, pale and hollow-eyed, but grateful. Sergeant Love now entered with a notebook and the air of a man torn between duty and disbelief. "So that's that then," he said. "All this fuss for a box of council funds buried since 1943. "Not fuss," said Purbright quietly. "Interest. Flaxborough has a remarkable capacity for interest when morality becomes decorative." Love frowned. Still, 20 years of secrecy. What was he thinking? "That he could make the past pay a dividend," Purbright replied. "When the war ended, a portion of the emergency fund was never properly accounted for. It sat in a tin chest beneath the old inspection shed, too awkward to explain and too embarrassing to declare. Larkins discovered it in the ledgers when he first took office, and he decided to keep the knowledge to himself. The money wasn't his to claim, but neither, he thought, did it belong to anyone who'd notice its absence." Love flipped through his notes. "And the lantern girl, the whole ghost business?" "A useful fiction," Purbright said. He needed a distraction, something to keep people away while he recovered the cash. A lantern and a veil are as good as a barricade when wielded by superstition. The first appearance during the parade gave him exactly what he wanted: fear wrapped in curiosity. After that, the hollow became his private vault. And the wallet, Bligh's
identification. Purbright lifted the envelope that still held the damp leather card.
That was almost poetic. Larkins found it among the old documents left behind by Bligh when he helped bury the chest. He must have realized it would lend his ghost a trace of authenticity. Bligh's name was perfect, respectable, tragic, conveniently deceased.
"A fine foundation for folklore," Love whistled softly. "But Bligh didn't die of any heart attack, did he?" Purbright's expression remained calm, but his voice dropped a fraction. "No, the post-mortem at the time said natural causes.
But I suspect he collapsed during an argument, likely with Larkins's predecessor, the clerk who started this little arrangement. Larkins was new then, ambitious, and very quiet. He would have seen what happened, perhaps even helped tidy it away. The ghost he resurrected wasn't Bligh, it was his own conscience wearing borrowed credentials." Love said nothing for a while, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the square was waking up. Shop shutters lifted, and the first delivery cart rattled past. "You think the town will ever know the truth?" he asked. Purbright smiled faintly. "Oh, it will know. Mrs. Gloss will make sure of that. But by the time she's finished telling it, the lantern girl will have married a soldier and emigrated to Canada, and the money will have been stolen by smugglers. My truth would only disappoint them." Love chuckled, though not entirely with humour. "And what of Brim? He's ruined, poor chap." "Only temporarily," said Purbright. "Flaxborough forgets faster than it forgives. Give him 6 months and a parish concert, and he'll be back in favour, perhaps even write a play about it." There was a pause, filled by the quiet ticking of the wall clock. The station seemed almost peaceful again, the kind of peace that follows small but significant repairs. "Funny thing, though," Love said after a while. "If you hadn't gone walking that night, we'd never have found him out." "Not funny," Purbright replied. "Necessary. There's a certain sound to guilt when it tries to move quietly. Once you hear it, you don't forget." He rose, stretching slightly, and walked to the window. The light outside was growing stronger, clear and cold. Across the square, Mrs. Gloss was opening her shop, pausing to arrange a vase of lilies in the window. Life, he reflected, was remarkably quick to resume its formalities. Love gathered the papers, still shaking his head. "Well, sir, I suppose that's the lantern girl laid to rest." Purbright's gaze lingered on the pale sky above the rooftops. "Oh, she'll linger a while yet. Every town needs its ghosts. They keep people honest, or at least remind them how easily honesty can be mislaid." He turned back to his desk, adjusted the stack of reports, and began to write his summary in neat, deliberate lines. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began to chime, each note cutting cleanly through the morning air. The sound was ordinary, untroubled, and final. Flaxborough, restored to its routines, went on pretending it had never been afraid of the dark.